So very excited. As many of you know, the museum is absolutely thriving. We're so excited with the pandemic, seemingly, at least, I don't know what we call it, but optimism is rising. Visitation has been growing. We've been really strong weekends and a really good test of where things are going. So we're having lots of pre-bookings for tickets that are weeks and months in advance, which is a good indicator of people's sort of confidence that you're going to have a good spring and summer ahead. So thanks to all of you who are bringing people from out of town to visit the museum. For those of you who are coming in our presence here, who are engaging with us in our virtual programs as well. If there's a silver lining over the last 2 years, it has been that we've really leaned into digital programming. And so we now are live streaming most of our evening programs. We had a wonderful email that came in about a week ago from someone who actually joined and became a member, cannot visit the museum because she's so distant, many states away. But she said, I've enjoyed your virtual programming so much, I decided to become a member of the museum. So I have to keep reminding myself, our 5th anniversary, only 5 years, is on April 19th of this year. So we're still a toddler, and half of that time has been during COVID, and so we really are just getting started here. I am also thinking very much over the last couple of days about the continuing relevance of the work we do and the story we're telling as we think about the terrible, terrible things happening in Ukraine, and thinking about how the continuing relevance of this story of how a world filled with monarchies and absolute power was transformed by events that really happened right here in this neighborhood and continue to shape the lives of people around the world. And so I know you'll join me, all of you, in keeping the people of Ukraine in our thoughts here tonight. I hope you all had a chance to take a look at this artifact that we put on display. As those who come to our evening programs know, we started last year trying to pull things out of the collection, often things that are not on regular display, and that are relevant to the evening. So what you're looking at is a coat that was a gift of Alexander Acevedo. He's a very acclaimed art and antiques dealer in New York City, who donated a group of objects, including a portrait of the man who owned this coat. He was, before the Revolutionary War, the private secretary to the governor of New Hampshire, royal governor of New Hampshire. They were forced to flee. His name is Thomas MacDonald. He was Irish. They were forced to flee, of course, as a result of the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. And he spent most of the war in Nova Scotia, in Halifax, and then went back home. And he returned to Boston after the war as the first British consul, who was appointed by His Majesty King George III. And so you were seeing a connection to the subject of this evening's talk. And I can't see him because I can't see so far, but where are you all? There it is in the back. Many of you know the honorary British consul Oliver St. Clair Franklin, our good friend here at the museum, who I've taken his picture next to that coat a few times. This is brought various ambassadors and other diplomats here at the museum, so we try to show off for you a little bit when you're here. And thanks for bringing your many guests here this evening. Of course, I thank you all for being warm supporters of the museum. I also want to recognize some people who are actually tuning in online tonight. Board members, Morris Offit, our board chair, and General John Jumper, our immediate past board chair, are watching through the cameras there. Peggy Duckett, who's a neighbor just down 3rd Street, but also a long-serving member of our board of directors, and Brigadier General Dr. Edith Mitchell, who's on the faculty at Jefferson University, also on our board of directors, who's tuning in. And our dear friend, who I know is dying that he is not here tonight, and Andrew, I know that this is the case, John Burkhalter from Princeton, who wanted to be here and has forgotten more about the musical and cultural life of the Georgian era than any of us in the room were able to know. So a special thank you and hello to you, John. I've got a few questions teed up that he wanted to ask you later. And finally, Ellie Rose, who is not able to tune in this evening, a friend of ours from New York, who actually is the person I know you know, Ellie, who first suggested that, Andrew Roberts is going to be promoting this book, George III. It's a really good book, and you should have it at the Museum of the American Revolution. So all of this came about, I think, because of that conversation with Kelly when he came down to tour the museum a few months ago. So, Professor Andrew Roberts. He read modern history and received his Ph.D. at Cambridge University. He's presently a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and the Royal Historical Society, the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. I really feel like I'm a achiever here. The Lehrman Institute Distinguished Lecturer at the New York Historical Society, our good friends in New York, and a visiting professor at the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. Professor Roberts is the best-selling author of numerous works that include The Storm of War, A New History of the Second World War, Masters and Commanders, How Four Titans Won the War in the West, 1941 to 1945, Waterloo, Napoleon's Last Gamble, and Napoleon, A Life, which was a winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Biography and a finalist for the Dark War. So he's won many other well-deserved accolades, but this book that we're going to be talking about, America's Last King, is setting the world on fire. Everyone I talk to says this is what everyone is either reading or should be reading. And we are looking forward to your remarks. It'll be followed by a little conversation, and we're really looking forward to a lively conversation with you all with lots of questions. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Roberts.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you, and thank you very much indeed, Scott, for those very kind words. When I told my wife that I was coming here to promote a book on what she calls Mad King George, she said to me, well, if you manage to pull that off, then you do realise that King Herod is going to get in touch to see whether or not you can help make him Parent of the Year. We know three things about George III, don't we? That he had porphyria, this terrible disease that drove him mad. That because of his madness, and also because of his obstinacy, he lost the American colonies for Britain. And that he deserved it, because, of course, he was a tyrant, and we know that because of what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence about him being unfit to be the ruler of the free people. And also, of course, that other tremendously important historical document, Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton. Ladies and gentlemen, all three of those things are completely false. He did not have porphyria. This comes about as the misdiagnosis of doctors in the 1960s who were given misleading symptoms by a mother and son medical team. And as a result, the doctors said that he had porphyria. This was later picked up by Alan Bennett in his famous play, The Madness of King George, which was turned into a movie and so on. But it's not true. He, in fact, called the modern medical opinion that's been given truthful symptoms. I go into this in some detail in the appendix of my book, recognised that in fact what King George III suffered from was bipolar disorder affected type 1, a form of manic depression. And anyhow, it wouldn't have mattered one way or the other with regard to the American Revolution, because the first major attack of this took place in 1788, 5 years after you had got your independence. But the most important of the three misconceptions is this idea that he was a tyrant. It was perfectly understandable why the founding fathers should have wanted to have clothed themselves in the way that they did in the mantle of the revolutionaries of 1642 against Charles I and 1688 against James II. However, in order to do that, you had to somehow make George III into a Stuart absolutist tyrant, which he absolutely wasn't. He didn't believe in the divine right of things. He believed and he venerated the Constitution of 1688, in which the monarchy's powers were limited, and in which he followed this constitution. The Declaration of Independence, which I notice you have engraved on your wall as you come in, those opening remarks, that first couple of paragraphs, make you proud to be human. They are beautiful, sublime, Shakespearean, that prose of the first third of it. However, I'm very pleased to see that you haven't got the second two-thirds up on your wall outside your entrance. Owing to the fact that it is a tissue of 28 clauses, ad hominem attacks, essentially, on George III. And of those 28, only 2 of them are water. However, the first of those 2, the 17th, which is about taxation, and the other one, the 22nd, which is about Parliament's veto rights over American legislation, in and of themselves justify the American Revolution. The 1770s was the right time for America to become independent. You had a population of 2.5 million, you had burgeoning 7% year-on-year growth. You had more bookshops here in this city of Philadelphia than in any other city of the empire apart from London. And so it was the correct time for this to happen. But that doesn't make, none of that, ladies and gentlemen, makes George III into a tyrant. He wasn't one. You can see in the 18th century any number of tyrants. You look at Catherine the Great of Russia, who put down the Pugachev uprising in with the deaths of 50,000 people. You can see what the French were doing in Corsica at the time, the Spanish in New Orleans, killing the whole of the leadership of the uprising there, what the Austrians and the Prussians were doing to the Poles at that time. There was such a thing as tyranny undoubtedly in the 18th century. But King George III, he never arrested an American editor, he never closed an American newspaper, he never tried to stop the Stamback Congress or the First Continental Congress from taking place, and he never sent any troops to any city, any American city, before the outbreak of the Revolution, except for Boston in 1768. One of the reasons that I think it's time to reassess George III is because Her Majesty the Queen in 2015 put online some 200,000 pages of what's called the Georgian Papers Programme, which is a wonderful collaboration between the Royal Archives and King's College London, where I'm proud to be a visiting professor. And what this has done, really, is to force us to look again at this man. About 100,000 of those pages are George III's. There's his letters and his memoranda and diaries, essentially, and so on. And the person who emerges is very, very different from the kind of figure that one gets from the Declaration of Independence and so on. And I'd like to read to you 2 sentences that I found in these archives, in which the young king, he was actually Prince of Wales at the time, in the 1750s, was writing about Montesquieu's Essays on the Laws. And he wrote this. What shall we say for a European traffic in black slaves? The very reasons urged for it will be perhaps sufficient to make us hold such practice in execration. For an inhuman custom, wantonly practiced by the most enlightened, polite nations in the world, there is no occasion to answer them, for they stand self-condemned. Ladies and gentlemen, George III never bought or sold a slave. In his life, he never owned a slave. He never invested in any of those companies that did that. He signed the legislation in 1807 that abolished the slave trade. And yet, for 200 years, he has been held on a lower moral plane than certainly the signatures of the Declaration of Independence, 42 out of the 56 of whom did own slaves. We also see the attacks made on him by Thomas Paine, the great 18th century pamphleteer, the writer of Common Sense, which was the biggest selling pamphlet of the 18th century, who called him the Royal Brute of Britain. This too is wartime propaganda. This was not to be taken at face value. The idea of George III being a brute is completely absurd. This is a man who, ladies and gentlemen, founded the Royal Academy, the institution that still exists today that attempted to raise the status of artists in society. He was the person who built up a personal library of 80,000 books, which forms the kernel of the British Library today, and which he allowed people, scholars like Joseph Priestley and Dr. Johnson, to come off the street and work on in Buckingham House. When the planet Uranus was discovered by William Herschel through the largest telescope in the world, which was partly financed by George III, Herschel actually named that planet originally after George III. He had the largest collection of scientific instruments. You can see them on the second floor of the Science Museum in London. And he built up that collection. Georgian architecture, the great neoclassical form of architecture that was promoted during his reign by people who he patronised, people like Robert Adam and James Wyatt and William Chambers and others. The idea that this person can be written off as some kind of a royal brute in Britain is absurd. He was in fact at the cutting edge of the Enlightenment. In his first speech to Parliament, his first speech at the state opening of 1761, he said, born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain. And he was the first person the first king for over 200 years to be born and educated in Britain. And he was very popular as a result. At the beginning of his reign, at least. He was also popular because he was interested in agriculture. He was sneered at by the intellectuals who called him Farmer George. But actually, the British people liked that because 80% of the British people took their livelihoods from agriculture at that time. He had a very unhappy childhood from the age of 12 onwards, when his beloved father, Frederick Prince of Wales, suddenly died of aneurysm. And the Hanoverians had an intergenerational loathing of each other that was so dysfunctional and weird that his grandfather, King George II, didn't allow his son, Frederick Prince of Wales' corpse to be buried. And instead, it decomposed in the bedroom directly above the 12-year-old young Prince of Wales to George III, until such time that the decomposing, putrefying corpse was so repulsive that it had to be buried. His grandfather, George II, would box his ears and abuse him. It was a truly horrific childhood, and yet George III did not allow it to screw him up. He was the only one of the Hanoverian kings who loved his wife, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who he married 6 hours after having met her. And with whom he had 15 children. It was a true love match. They fell in love after they got married, and the children, most of the children, worked out very well, except for George, Prince of Wales, the eldest of them, who later became King George IV, the Prince Regent. And in the course of the 3 years that I took to research and write this book, I literally could not find a single redeeming feature about George IV. But otherwise, he was a very fine George III was a very fine father, and certainly can't be blamed for what happened with George IV. My book isn't in any sense a hagiography. He got lots of things wrong. He was tremendously self-righteous. He never thought he'd really done anything wrong, which, considering that the loss of the American colonies was the greatest catastrophic disaster to overtake Britain strategically, really, from the loss of the Angevin lands in the 15th century right the way through to the fall of France in 1940, was quite something. He can't be said to have had a great sense of humour either. Well, I like to call it a Hanoverian sense of humour. They said of the Hanoverians that nothing made them laugh so much as when you caught your finger in the door. It's the old Mel Brooks line, what's the opposite of comedy? Germany. And so what one has to do in a book when you're writing about somebody who was never funny, of course I never had this problem when I was writing about Winston Churchill and Napoleon and so on, because they were so funny, but George III, you have to slightly shoehorn in gags from the rest of the reign, and luckily that wasn't too difficult, because the late 18th century was, of course, the absolute apogee of parliamentary wit and repartee and so on. And I know lots of you have heard this gag before, but nonetheless I'm going to tell it because it's my favourite joke of the late 18th century, which was when Lord Sandwich, the Earl of Sandwich, the first Lord of the Admiralty under George III, was attacking the radical journalist John Wilkes. And I was very pleased to see that you have almost an entire section here in this wonderful museum devoted to John Wilkes. And when Sandwich said of John Wilkes that he would either die of the pox or on the gallows, Wilkes replied, well, that depends, Your Lordship, on whether or not I embrace Your Lordship's principles or your mistress. George III was a brave man, personally. He acted with tremendous sang-froid on the 6 occasions when he was subjected to an assassination. 6 times they tried to, various people tried to kill him. My favourite act of sang-froid was when he was shot at the beginning of an opera and then went to sleep in the interval. He was brave during the 1779 attempted invasion by France and Spain, in the 1803 to 1805 threats of Napoleon's. He was tremendously brave also in the Gordon riots, which one week in June 1780, destroyed more of London than anything else in the whole history of London, from the Great Fire of London through to the London Blitz in 1940. And on that occasion, his aide-de-camp said that the king did not know what fear was. And then, really, another tremendous act of bravery was dealing with his terrible affliction, especially the kind of tortures that his doctors imposed on him. They didn't understand about mental illness in the late 18th century. It was just not properly understood as a branch of medical science. And so they straitjacketed the king for days on end. They attached him to a chair that was nailed to the floor. They cupped him, which is a terrible thing where a glass is put on your arm or your thigh and heated up to create massive artificial blistering. They took huge amounts of blood from him, and they did enough. Needless to say, this is exactly the wrong way to deal with anybody who's suffering from mental illness or manic depression. One of the pleasing things really about this being the first major cradle to the grave biography of George III in half a century, is that it's also the first one really, to have been written since the destigmatization of mental illness. And no longer can George III, as he has been for 200 years by the Whig historians, blamed for his own mental collapse. And he also showed tremendous bravery when in 1804 he had cataracts on his eyes and the doctors put leeches on his eyeballs. I think that the king has, over the years, especially by these Whig historians who I mentioned, been blamed far too much for the defeat in the American War of Independence. There was only one real British strategic plan of any seriousness, and that was the Germain plan that Lord George Germain, the American secretary, came up with, which was to try to bring Sir William Howe up from New York, up the Hudson, at the same time that Sir John Burgoyne was coming south from Canada, to meet in or around Albany and thereby, through the control of the Hudson Valley, split off the New England colonies from the rest of the American colonies. That was the plan. And as we all know, and you Philadelphians know better than anyone else, Sir William Howe instead veered off eastwards to capture Philadelphia, occupy it for 9 months, and as a direct result, Sir John Burgoyne got captured at Saratoga in October 1777 with his entire force. And what that did, as well as the defeat in and of itself, was of course to bring the French into the conflict. 4 months later, they joined America against Britain. The French are always there when they need you. The result was also, of course, that the next year, in 1779, the Spanish declared war on Britain, and in 1780 the Dutch, and what had been a colonial conflict, and one in which Britain was not doing well anyway, because we never actually dedicated at any one time more than 50,000 troops to this theatre, which was nothing like enough for 13 colonies of 2.5 million people. Suddenly, we also had to fight in the West Indies, in the East Indies, in the Mediterranean, when Gibraltar was subjected to a grueling 1,000-day siege, in the Channel, as I mentioned, in Africa, and also in America. So it was a hiding to nothing, but this cannot be blamed on George III. He was not responsible for the grand strategy. That was Germain, the North government, the commander-in-chief in Britain, and of course the generals on the spot in America. Men like Cornwallis and Clinton and Sir William Howe and others. And they simply were not up to the task of taking on the extraordinary concatenation of talent that you had in the 1770s. It was, and it was borne home to me even more strongly than usual by your exhibits in this tremendous museum. The idea that you have in the same decade, when we have got people like Lord North, General Cornwallis and Germain and so on, you have a polymath of the genius of Ben Franklin. You have a leader with the charisma of George Washington, and also other generals, dashing generals like Napoleon Prix. That you've got somebody with the economic nous of Alexander Hamilton. That you've got somebody who can write like Thomas Jefferson. You've got a politician like John Adams. You've got Madison and Monroe. And they all come in the same decade of the 1770s. It's truly infuriating. The defeat when it came in the ultimate disaster 2 years, obviously, after Yorktown, was something that George III did everything in his power to stave off. But when it came, he, of course, accepted it. And when he met John Adams in June 1785, there was a moment, I think, of great graciousness when he met him at St. James's Palace at the audience there, the first audience, the first American ambassador to the court of St. James. And he said this: "I'll be very frank with you. I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I've always said, and I say now, that I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power." And then, in the March of 1797, when George Washington retired as president, at the end of his second presidency, King George III said that he was the greatest character of the age. George III was very unlucky, really, in his long reign, the longest reign of any king of England, nearly 60 years. Of the 14 prime ministers who he appointed, only 2 of them were really remarkable. William Pitt the Elder, who by 1766 was too ill, too infirm to be an effective prime minister. tragically 1 year after the passing of the Stamp Act. And of course, his son, William the Younger, although he was brilliant during the Napoleonic Wars, was too young to be involved in any way. He was only in his teens during the American War of Independence. But many of the lessons of the American War of Independence were learnt by George III in the continuing struggles that overtook Britain in the 1780s and the 1790s against France, and subsequently, of course, in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution, which of course came as a result, direct result of the French Revolution, of the French having spent so much money tearing away the American colonies from Britain. So there is such a thing as justice. When one looks at the legacy of George III, I think the thing that strikes me most is the way in which he is really the founder of the modern monarchy. He is somebody who, much more than his granddaughter, Queen Victoria, actually created the limited constitutional monarchy we have enjoyed ever since. He was also somebody who bought the Buckingham House, now Buckingham Palace. He bought this gold state coach, which is being refurbished as we speak for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, 250 years after he bought it. He invented the Royal Walkabout, the annual treatment of the colour, the royal enclosure at Ascot, the tradition whereby kings of England are buried at Windsor. And also, I think, when one sees Her Majesty the Queen today, one can recognise in her frugality of eating and drinking, in her financial prudence, in her commitment to duty, in her tremendous commitment to hard work, the echoes of her great-grandfather. The other day I went to, just to conclude, I went to Washington to look at the Declaration of Independence at your National Archives. I was looking for loopholes. And I was, I have to say, somewhat shocked to see that there is a trigger warning attached to the Declaration, which states that, and I quote, there are things in the Declaration that are outdated, biased, and offensive about your founding document of your nation. Now, obviously, with regard to George III, I agree with that. There are lots of things that are outdated, biased, and offensive. But overall, ladies and gentlemen, anyone who thinks that an 18th century document is not going to be outdated is frankly moronic. And it reminds me of this great debate that you sometimes have in this country about exceptionalism, whether America is exceptional. And it strikes me that there are any number of peoples and nations throughout history, who have taken their independence, who have grasped their independence from people who have oppressed them. And things of the Israelites escaping the Egyptians, the Dutch against the Spanish, the Italians against the Austrians, the Greeks against the Turks, and so on. But I think what makes America truly exceptional is that you demanded your sovereign independence, your right of self-government, from a people who were not oppressing you, and a king who was not a tyrant. Thank you very much.
Weeks ago, I would have said, maybe that becoming Canada would have been a good option for us, but there was that Trump thing that happened. So we're going to definitely be passing the mic around for some questions, but I'd just like to ask a couple to give everyone a chance to think about it. Can we have a hand for Ryan?
this was a well-run place.
I might have texted him and said, I'm a little jealous. The professor was smart enough to preset his class. Obviously, a pro. So I want to press a little bit for some detail and some thoughts around George III, abolitionist. Of course, you've been through the core exhibition. We have a very powerful section, or sometimes freedom, or red coat. We explore beginning with Lord Dunmore's proclamation and other actions by British commanders in North America to offer freedom to enslaved people of rebel masters. And that has led to a lively public debate at the moment, of course, put forth most provocatively by the New York Times, about this idea of the Declaration of Independence as a document that was defending slavery against an abolitionist empire. And I'm just curious, for George III in particular, aside from this essay, I mean, is there evidence of him being aware of these actions, any commentary, or can you?
Well, I don't believe there's that much evidence in the essay. In fact, I'm not persuaded by the 1619 project and its statements about this. It's true, of course, that slavery was illegal ever since the Magna Carta, that in the Mansfield judgment in 1772 it was re-established that any slave who stepped on British soil was automatically freed. However, that doesn't mean that there were any plans to extend abolition to the American colonies, any more than there were to the West Indian colonies, where slavery, of course, continued until 1833. So I'm unpersuaded, as I say, by this. It's George III, to be specific about him, was tremendously, as I mentioned, he was a constitutional monarch and a limited government monarch. He very much went along with what the majority of the House of Commons and the majority of the cabinet felt. And there was never a majority during his lifetime for abolition. And so one can criticise him for that, obviously, but he wasn't a proactive force for abolition. But he was very happy, of course, to sign the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. All I was trying to argue in my speech was that he certainly shouldn't be seen as being on a lower moral plane than people who did own slaves.
So to delve into kind of counterfactual history, which historians are loath to do.
I edited a book of that.
Okay, here's the question. There was and again, something that we explore, I think, very richly in the galleries is, first of all, reminding people that there's a resistance movement that does not start off as a revolution. There's an evolution in thinking. And early 1776, and often Common Sense and Thomas Paine's role is played up, rightfully so, published just a walk from where we're sitting. But also the arrival, almost simultaneously, of the news of King George's speech in Parliament, his refusal to read Congress's petition, etc. Do you think that he could have played that a different way? Or what were the sort of circumstances around the reaction there?
Again, the problem with taking Congress's address, and there were three essentially, weren't there, was that if you do, you recognise Congress. And you've automatically, therefore, legitimised a central feature of the Constitution that, as far as Britain is concerned, did not exist, because there were 13 colonies and there wasn't a Congress. So it was a political decision to ignore that. Much more interestingly, I think, also, is that we don't know that he ever read the Declaration of Independence. I'm certain he must not have, because he was a great reader of newspapers, and it was, of course, in all the papers, especially the radical ones. However, under normal circumstances, you'd have had some response from him, because he was a great letter writer, wrote thousands and thousands of letters, always dated them to the minute, because he was that kind of guy. And yet we have absolutely nothing from him about what he thought about it. But no, it was a deliberate political response, not just of him again, but from the government, not to recognise and thus legitimise a body that they recognise to be revolutionary.
Can we turn to arts and culture for a moment? Of course, we have a great connection. Our native son, Benjamin West, born of Quaker heritage and at least by legend taught by Native Americans how to mix pigments, and he was at least good at spinning a sort of a pre-Benjamin Franklin PR guy for himself. But again, rises within the court, becomes very closely and intimately involved with the royal family. And I just say that to just, if you could talk a little bit just about George III as a man of the Enlightenment, of arts and culture, his engagement with music and...
Well, that's right. Well, West, of course, who grew up so close to here, was a very fine loyalist and a very fine painter, and the king trusted him. In fact, that phrase about the greatest character of the age about George Washington comes from Benjamin West. But as well as the huge numbers of paintings that the king commissioned from Benjamin West, lots of them that can be seen at Windsor at the moment, he was also hugely involved in music. I must have missed this out in my speech, because George III, in that Enlightenment way, invited Mozart to speak to play at Buckingham House. He tried to keep Joseph Haydn in Britain, and Handel said of him that while this boy lives, my music needs no other champion. So, again, a royal brute, ladies and gentlemen, who does this, has this level of musical ability, and he played 4 musical instruments. He just was an Enlightenment figure that I think that's very often misinterpreted.
Our dream is in this space to have a music of George III concert, perhaps in the fall. So stay tuned. Dr. Tyler Putman, I would love for you to bring some of our guests in. If any of you would like to ask a question, just.
Thank you. We will throw our first question to our friends online who don't have the opportunity to get their book signed and ask follow-up questions. This one comes from our pal Chuck Downs. To what degree can the decision to send Hessian soldiers, parenthetical, much despised by Americans, be attributed to George III himself and not to parliamentary strategy?
Very good question. And Tyler, can I thank you for showing me around the museum earlier? It was absolutely great, and I love the passion that you feel for everything that's here. Yes, very much down to George III. The people who, and one shouldn't just call them Hessians, obviously, because they came from lots of the German states, and one also shouldn't call them mercenaries, because they were auxiliaries. They didn't get the money themselves. The money went to their ruler. And so there's a huge difference between that, at least amongst military historians. They were actually rather good soldiers. That's another thing that's very often misunderstood. They were regulars. They had, many of them fought before, of course, in the 7 Years' War. And it was a very well-known thing that has been part of European wars for hundreds of years, that you hired soldiers as well as just took them from the countries involved. The American revolutionaries also used mercenaries. I think it's auxiliaries, but I think it's worthwhile pointing out as well. But you're right. Of course, they were hugely hated and feared and despised. Because this was no longer a war essentially between English cousins. It was one in which the king used his German cousins as well. And that was tremendously unpopular, and probably might have been a mistake, but the fact was there were 20,000 of them. out of an entire British army of only the maximum 50,000. And it's very difficult to work out unless we had had some form of conscription, which we didn't have. I mean, we didn't fight a total war. That was part of the problem in a sense. We didn't put the amount of money into it, we didn't put the amount of effort into it. And the war was very unpopular in Britain until the French got involved. Which it suddenly became rather popular. But up until 1778, it was difficult to get English recruits.
Thank you. We'd be happy to take questions from the room. If you just raise your hand really high, I'll bring you the microphone and you can talk away. So, happy to take questions.
I will start calling on people if you don't raise your hands. Okay, Kevin Metcher, you're up.
You got it.
Being an American, I've always associated Hessian troops with mercenaries. I really. So how are you distinguishing that they did not get the money?
No, they didn't get paid directly by Britain. They were already regular troops of the Hessian army, and so the person who got the money was in this case, I think, the Grand Duke of Hesse. And it's so they're not just sort of people who are roaming around looking to try to sell their arms to the highest bidder in the way that the condottieri were in the 16th century Italy, for example. They were specific regiments that had fought together and belonged to the Grand Duke of Hesse.
Did you pay them?
Yes, no, I'm not saying that they didn't go, that they went unpaid, but the term mercenary is a very emotive term, and it's not the actual correct one for what these soldiers were. They were auxiliary forces to the British Army. I go into some detail in my book.
And so, who the American mercenaries? I never thought we had that.
Yeah, you did. You had some French auxiliary forces that were paid directly by Congress. You got, I think von Steuben was paid.
He was volunteer.
No. He was volunteered to be paid. And again, in the book, I go through the groups and the corps of the troops that Congress paid.
Happy to get another one from the room, and I'll take one from Zoom.
Thank you. At what age is there any records of when his mental illness manifested itself? Or was it precipitated by his great stress involved with that?
That's a very good question, and of course I go into this in some detail as well, because the first what's called prodrome attack took place in 1765. It was a very short, it was just a matter of weeks, maybe a couple of months. It didn't overlap with the Stamp Act Congress, the Stamp Act, the passing of the Stamp Act. And so I don't think it has any political overtones. However, no other historian up until now has specified that, no other biographer of George III has specified, certainly, that this 1765 attack was a manic depressive attack. Others say that it was a bad cold, but you don't have bad colds that go on for 2 months in that way. And the way it was hushed up essentially by the Queen and the court, and some people years later who were working in the court do state that the king was mentally afflicted by during the attack. So he was then, he's born in 1738, he was 27. And then there's a big gap until 1788, when the 6-month-long attack of bipolar hits him. Then you get another one in 1804 for a couple of months, 1801 for a couple of months, 1804 for about 4 months. And then in 1810, he has the really big final one. And those last 10 years are tremendously pathos laden, because he has got blind and deaf by that point, and also senile. And so he's put away in an apartment in Windsor Castle, and of course dies in January 1820.
You said that King George was a voracious letter writer and very detailed in his communication. We've always been taught that when we visited Texas, there was a huge population of loyalists in the colonies. Was there any sort of direct communication that occurred in favor, or was it always done through the administration of the colonies themselves?
Yes, it was always the latter. You're right, John Adams himself thought that about a third of Americans were loyalists, a third were revolutionaries, and a third were sort of waiting to see which side won. And the loyalists, the British Army placed far too much emphasis on the loyalists. They believed, up to the Battle of King's Mountain at least, that the loyalists would be able to hold down large parts of the colonies for the king. And that was simply not the case. The king was kind and friendly and supportive to loyalists. Of course, they were loyal to him, especially at the end of the war, when so many of them, 70,000+ of them, went up from New York to Canada and then spread out across the empire and were seen to essentially build the Second British Empire in India and Canada and Africa and elsewhere. So you have this sense of the king. I mentioned Benjamin West earlier, that there are an awful lot of them. That great patriotic hero Benedict Arnold, for example, was helped by the king and was given a pension, and his son held land in Canada and so on. So he did try and take care of the loyalists as much as he could. But essentially, understandably, they were sort of ethnically cleansed and burned out of the nascent republic.
Professor Roberts, we've been getting some great attention through Zoom. I might consolidate a few questions we've been getting about George III's education and his identity to ask, what did his early education have to do with him adopting the identity of a Briton or of Britishness?
Gosh, that's a very good question. I do go into it in some detail in the first two chapters of the book because it's tremendously important. So my very strong sense is that his influence up until the age of 12 of his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, was essential in this. Frederick, Prince of Wales, wanted to differentiate himself from the Germanness of his father, George II, his grandfather, George I. Even though German was his first language as well, he very much wanted George III to be seen as the English king. And so well, a classic example is when he took over the house, he leased the house Clifton in Buckinghamshire and had Thomas Arne play Rule Britannia, actually for the first time at Clifton at a party that Frederick Prince of Wales organised. He would put on plays that George III took part in which George III played patriotic English roles rather than the German ones. He was very much a believer in the ideas that came from Bolingbroke. The idea of the patriot king that Bolingbroke wrote in 1737 was a manifesto, essentially, of Englishness for Frederick Prince of Wales that was picked up by George III. And they had, therefore, also a strong sense that the Whig oligarchs who could essentially run Britain ever since the Glorious Revolution were accreting powers to themselves, the small cousinage of aristocratic Whigs, and keeping out everybody else. And so what George III did was to try to bring in Tories, try to bring in independents, even Scots, which was very unpopular at the time, exactly, so soon after the the Jacobite Rebellion, and slightly sort of widen and diversify the gene pool essentially from which you could take future leaders, which the Whigs hated, and which their historians for 200 years afterwards denounced George III.
As is our great tradition, we will allow Scott Stephenson to have the last question.
And he is the head that wears the crown. So I've been thinking through this evening, reflecting back to 1976, on the site that we're sitting in. This is the visitor center that was built for the American Bicentennial. And Her Majesty was here on July 4th, 1976, dedicated a gift of a replica of the Liberty Bell, which was placed in a tower, Rapunzel-like, and then when the ringing mechanism broke a few months later, for nearly half a century, never rang again. I don't know what's been made of that. But there used to be a plaque before when we acquired the site through a land exchange and then took the old building down and built the Museum of the American Revolution. There used to be a bronze plaque of a portion of Her Majesty's speech that was on this location, which reflected on not conceding by any means the rightness of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, but reflecting on the impact of the American Revolution on Britain, and then more widely, of course, in the world. I'm just curious, as we are looking ahead to 2026 and the 250th of that moment, and thinking about the world as it is today, do you just have any thoughts, aspirations, hopes, dreams, desires of what that moment might look like?
I think we don't have to really even look so far ahead as 2026 to appreciate the incredibly powerful resonances of that first third of the Declaration. The first third that you have rightly engraved on your wall reminds us, especially with regard to human rights and representation and democracy, essentially, what is what we're all about. And when we saw that terrible morning 2 days ago, what Vladimir Putin is all about, an attempt to extinguish democracy in an independent and sovereign country, which has been an independent and sovereign country for 30 years and has historical past going back centuries, separate from Russia. It strikes me that you have to go back to the founding principles of this country, really, to have it in writing, in stone, and in the hearts of people about what self-determination is all about. And that's why I think today the words of Thomas Jefferson in that opening section are as true today as they were on the day he said them, and that is extraordinary considering it was 250 years ago today. So the kernel, the sense of what Jefferson was trying to, did brilliantly and beautifully in such sublime prose, managed to say, is as true today as it